It's spooky season, and in honor of Halloween, we've decided to go to a dark, secluded location, and by the flicker of the light of candle,
talk about things that go bump in the night.
So, we want to talk about scary movies in general, horror movies, thriller movies, things that make you not be able to go to sleep, make you look under your bed, check your closets, under your cars, things that give you the willies.
Things that you're convinced are there at night, but swear aren't true by the light of day.
Exactly. So, we've got a lot of things we want to cover. This is going to be a very thorough episode. A lot of things to cover as far as horrors, thrillers, twists, all kinds of things.
Ghosts, goblins, and long-legged beasties.
A little bit of everything. I know for me personally, and I think for you as well, it goes back to the 80s and what we grew up with.
Slasher movies.
The big name slasher movies. Friday the 13th.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Halloween.
Of course.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, all of these that they're franchises. You know, Friday the 13th to me that's the king. Jason Voorhees. You know, he's just about as iconic as it's going to get in horror.
When I think horror, I definitely think of Jason Voorhees. You know, the hockey mask, the machete. It's all synonymous with horror, and he is the premier slasher.
Absolutely. You know, when I think of horror, just straight up horror movies, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But around the same time for me, when I was watching those movies, I was also watching the Nightmare on Elm Street movies.
Sure.
So Freddy Krueger to me is also a very big icon.
Well, you know, I think like everything else, when you have apples and oranges, Jason and Freddy, the Beatles and Elvis, you do pick a side. I always land on the side of Jason when you put the two of them against each other.
As do I.
Maybe the mythology I like better. Maybe just the icon of Jason. Maybe the kills.
It's, to me, standard formula horror movies.
You know, even before I started watching the movies, there was a Nintendo game, Friday the 13th.
I remember it.
And I actually played the game before I had seen any of the movies. So that shows me just what an icon that the character of Jason was, that he bridged that gap. You know, not only was he in the movies, but he's also in video games, he's in comic books, there's toys.
Yeah, there's... What's funny to me is, you know, these two were the number one and number two big horror franchises coming out of the 80s. And eventually, they made Jason versus Freddy, which was almost as much a comedy as it was a horror movie for how silly it was.
Oh, it's silly.
The moment in there where the girl's giving Jason CPR in the van, like, that was where they just crossed the line at that point. Because no clear-thinking human being would do such a thing.
Well, you know, when you say crossing the line, I know that there always comes to a point in a movie like Freddy vs. Jason where the fans take this position where, oh, that's just too goofy for me, right?
Right.
But the movie before that, as far as, you know, in the line of movies, Friday the 13th, Jason Goes to Hell.
Yeah.
It was pretty fucking horrible.
But, you know, he also went to Manhattan.
No, look, Manhattan wasn't great. But Jason Goes to Hell, you know, the coroner eats his heart, and then he's possessed by Jason, and then they tell the whole mythology that through a Voorhees he can be reborn, and then the heart is running around like a little demon.
I remember that, man. That was so ridiculous.
Look, it legit goes into his relative's vagina, and then a full adult Jason in mask and coveralls with machete rips out of her stomach and then proceeds to kill people. Okay? That's hokey ass shit.
Well, that's the thing. When you make as many movies as they have in those franchises, you know, you got to come up with new things.
Well, no. Well, see, Nightmare on Elm Street had the advantage of, when it started, it was fantastical. It was magic. He was a demon. He made a deal with the dream people so, he could come back for revenge after the adults killed him. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Shout out to Robert Englund and his bit part in the most recent season of Stranger Things. I thought was very nice. Very, very cool homage to him.
I mean, Robert Englund is as much of a staple to the horror genre as Stephen King. Now, I don't want to get into that just yet. But where Robert Englund epitomizes Freddy Krueger, even though there has been another actor that played Freddy Krueger, to me, you don't get Freddy Krueger without Robert Englund.
I do think Jackie Earl Haley to replace Robert Englund as the new Freddy Krueger, even though I didn't watch that, but I figured if you're going to pick somebody to replace him, that was a solid choice.
Look, a lot of people hate the remake, and I think when it comes down to it, they hate the remake because Robert Englund didn't play Freddy Krueger. They did the same thing with Friday the 13th, which I actually really enjoyed. The remake of Friday the 13th.
One I was a big fan of was Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. A little less fantastical and a little more just insane. Crazy people in Texas killing, eating, whatever else, man. It's Leatherface is wild.
My parents didn't really police what I watched growing up.
Yeah.
But Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of those movies that they urged me against watching when I was at a younger age. So it was years into my adulthood before I actually saw the original. I actually saw the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre before I saw the original.
The Matthew McConaughey one?
No, not Next Generation. No, the one with the guy from Full Metal Jacket.
R. Lee Ermey.
Yes. Jessica Biel in that one, too.
Well, needless to say, I like Leatherface. I don't know why it appealed to me as a kid, that character, because that's a terrible character.
Now, was it just that character and the way he looked, or was it like the whole feel and the house and the family and the seclusion?
The underground bits and I remember it almost seemed like there was a bit leading to their property. That like you were inside a giant carcass of some kind.
I can see that.
There was it looked like rib bones coming up,
Yeah.
but I don't remember what the structure was.
Sure.
But
yeah, it was a meatpacking plant.
It's just the aesthetic of that movie to me was like true horror, man.
Yeah.
Because it's like, realistic to a degree.
Well, and I think, us being in a society where we're trying to be civilized, anytime there's it's dirty and it's grungy, and the thing about Texas Chainsaw Massacre is I think it's a lot more frightening when a slasher comes at you with a chainsaw that has gore and blood hanging off of it.
Right.
Than if it's a chainsaw that looked like he just pulled it out of the package.
Or if it maybe had sawdust on it, because, chainsaws have sawdust on it.
Agreed.
But yeah, Leatherface, leather, human skin on his face. It's terrifying.
Do you think Pinhead and the Cenobites fall into the slasher category? Or is that a different thing altogether?
That's a little more dark sci-fi to me. It is. It fell into the horror category back then, but to me, looking back on it, I always felt like Hellraiser was more sci-fi / occult.
Well, I get where you're coming from with that. Because even when I was a kid, the first time I had watched Hellraiser, they had more of an alien feel to them than they did actually like demons from hell.
It could fall under, it's really up to your interpretation, I guess.
Sure.
To each their own, I suppose, when it comes to that particular franchise. Not one I ever really watched a whole lot of, but I really like the aesthetic of Hellraiser. I think it looks cool. Pinhead.
Who doesn't like leather and chains and sweat and blood?
Yeah, it's just, it's fascinating, but it was never really my thing.
What's funny about the slasher genre when we were growing up as kids, the one that actually scared me was Child's Play.
Never was a big fan of Child's Play. I always felt like the killer doll was so corny.
Well, you have to understand that when that movie came out, I was about 8 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
And around the time that Child's Play came out, the My Buddy doll was very popular.
Buddy?
Right, My Buddy.
My buddy and me.
Well, let me tell you about My Buddy. All right, Child's Play came out, and I watched it, and it scared the shit out of me. So me and my brother actually cracked the head open of this doll to make sure there wasn't a soul inside.
That's funny.
We had my father take that doll to the dumpster down the road and throw it out.
That's great.
Right. Now, Jason never scared me. Most of the time, I thought the people were getting what was coming to them.
Honestly, man, we grew up in the South. Nobody played hockey in the South back then, so we weren't seeing very many hockey masks.
No, now the hills have eyes. Now that was a horror story that could have came true.
Yeah, no doubt. Or Deliverance, even though that's a whole other thing altogether.
No shit.
I'd be remiss if we didn't at least cover Halloween a little bit. Of the major franchises, Halloween was never one I was a big fan of.
My brother was a huge Halloween fan, and so I've watched them several times. The thing that I liked about Michael Myers is that he stole cars. He had to eat. You know, the fact that he was human and they let you know that he was human, that made him a little scarier than Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger. You know, supernatural scare. I've always said that. Ghosts and vampires and demons, they're horrifying. But real world horror, that's what scares me. The fact that when I walk out of the room, these things could actually kill me.
One example of that, it's gotten me a little off topic thinking about it because of what we've been trying to cover here as far as what we grew up with. But something that's actually a little more modern, I'm actually quite a big fan of, is some of the early Rob Zombie movies that I feel like are homages to that period in time. And the first two, House of a Thousand Corpses and Devil's Rejects, are absolutely fantastic movies in the vein of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but more stylized because it's a little more modern time and it's Rob Zombie.
You know, speaking of growing up horror, the tease of House of a Thousand Corpses, I believe, came about 4 or 5 years before the movie actually came out.
I believe it did.
The first trailer I saw for that was literally just two people in hazmat suits digging up a grave.
I remember that.
Raining, lightning striking, and just said, Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses.
I'm not going to dwell on Rob Zombie because we could end up having a whole big chunk of another episode about him. But just to summarize, Rob Zombie, tiny fucked a stump.
Tiny fucked a stump.
But moving on from that, a movie that I was a big fan of when I was a kid was Poltergeist.
Oh, man.
I loved Poltergeist. They're here.
Look,
like, that's...
Talk about a movie that scared the shit out of me when I was a kid.
Well,
man.
you and I, we were kids when that came out. And that scared the shit out of me, man. I thought stuff was going to come through the TV and get me,
I was
man.
just going to say, probably for 10 years after I watched that movie, I could not be around a television that was on static, man.
Right.
You know, even when I was a teenager and I would wake up in the middle of the night and my television was on static, I had to immediately get up and turn that shit off, man.
It's, that was an unnerving movie. And if I'm not mistaken, because I really honestly haven't watched it in a long time, that's the movie that originated the whole building something on an Indian burial ground trope.
Building it on, it was just a cemetery. It wasn't actually an Indian burial ground. It was just a cemetery. They were supposed to relocate the bodies, but because it was cost efficient, they relocated the tombstones and left the bodies behind.
Yes, that's correct. Again, like I said, it's been a very long time since I've watched that, but that trope in general of building something and it being cursed because of graves started with
Oh,
Poltergeist.
absolutely. You know, I was going to say, though, that's what's funny about it, is definitely the trope of building something on graves and it becoming haunted.
Yeah, Poltergeist also makes me think of houses that are haunted.
Well, when you talk about houses that are haunted, Amityville. That's the pinnacle haunted house movie. The son, Danny, later on in life, he made a documentary that I believe premiered on either Amazon or Netflix. You know, who knows nowadays? If you don't believe in ghosts or possession or, you know, demonic entities, and you may not, that's fine. This will convince you. This kid, now bear in mind, he's an adult. He's in his 50s now. He saw something. You know, whether it was he was abused by his stepfather and that he like warped his mind, or he actually saw some shit in that house, he convinced me, for sure. I don't want to dwell on that too much. You know, I have my own feelings. I do believe that the Amityville story was real. I do believe that happened to some degree. But talking about movies like Amityville and Poltergeist, you know, they both had some really solid remakes.
The Ryan Reynolds Amityville was quite good, and the thing I took away more from that than anything other than Ryan Reynolds being absolutely shredded is the fact that as a comedic actor, he was scary. He was very scary in that.
Well, look, you know, we all love Deadpool and we all love Ryan Reynolds. Just Ryan Reynolds. You know,
Van Wilder.
Dude, Van Wilder and
Waiting.
Just Friends, you know.
He's funny.
Dude, he's
great.
He's a funny dude. But what's great about an actor like him that's funny, or like Jim Carrey, when they do a thriller or a horror movie.
Cable Guy.
Well, I was thinking number 23 when it comes to Jim Carrey.
That's a solid thriller.
Absolutely. But Ryan Reynolds in Amityville, when you watch that, you want to ask yourself, why does Ryan Reynolds make all these goofy, you know, like Free Guy and Waiting and that kind of shit? You know, Ryan Reynolds could be sitting on a pile of Oscars. But to me, it just shows that he chooses not to. He does the projects he wants to do.
That dude is all about having fun in life.
I agree.
And hoping the people around him have fun in life.
I agree.
So
there's a lot of actors out there that have Oscars that could not carry his jockstrap in a briefcase.
Agreed, 100%. Big fan of Ryan Reynolds. If you hear us, Ryan Reynolds, call us, say hello. We'd love to hear from you. You know, thinking back to a lot of the stuff that you and I grew up with, one thing that's always going to come to mind, and that's the master of horror.
Stephen King.
Absolutely. And I've seen, and look, I don't like all of the stuff that's based on Stephen King stuff, but I've seen a bunch of it. I don't even remember all the ones that I've seen. Like, I know I've seen The Langoliers, but I don't even remember anything about it. Ton of good stuff. You know, I mentioned Christine before in a previous episode. Big fan.
Stephen King as a writer and a creator, you know, he may have started out with a few horror stories. You know, the miniseries It is what blew him up. It's what made him mainstream. That and The Stand. Every writer today that tries to come up with something original, whether it's on purpose and trying to hide it or whether it's subconscious, I think everyone pulls from Stephen King in one form or another.
Stephen King, to me, even though I'm a medium fan of Stephen King's works, a lot of stuff I don't like, but he figured out a formula many years ago and was able to recreate that formula over and over and over and over and over and just change what the story was about.
Stephen King finds horror in the mundane.
Exactly. Ton of good Stephen King stuff out there. And honestly, I'm sure we could do an entire episode on Stephen King if we wanted to.
Absolutely. Stephen King could have his own show.
In thinking about the spooky season from different aspects of it, you know, I think about what I refer to more as opposed to horror, having them to be a thriller. a little more drama based in your horror, I guess you could say, if you wanted to do that. And I've been thinking about a few. There's one that you and I have talked about a lot recently, and I recently rewatched because it is a great movie. And oddly enough, when I first saw it, I thought it was a Stephen King movie just because of the subject matter. And that's the movie Frailty.
Frailty is a spooky movie.
It is. It's scary. It's a bit gory at times. It's psychological. It's a movie I'm sure a lot of people have seen, and I'm sure a lot of people haven't seen, and maybe have never even heard of.
Frailty is worthy of in-depth analysis.
It is, and I know we had discussed the possibility of doing an episode on Frailty, but I feel like it fits in too well here not to be discussed, so we're going to do it now.
From just a horror standpoint, the thing that sticks out in my head the most is when they nab the woman from the parking lot.
Yep.
And they have her in the hole. That horror on her face.
It's terrifying.
And the way her eyes widen when he touches her, I feel scared for her and scared for myself.
It's a take on humanity, and played through the context of somebody seeing religion at work that they can't understand. I guess we should mention, it stars Bill Paxton as Dad, Matthew McConaughey as a grown-up, one of his sons, tells a tale in two different timelines.
When I first watched Frailty, it was easy for me to put myself in the shoes of Fenton Meeks because I've always had my skepticism about religion. So it was a very twist ending when you watch the movie for the first time and find out that everything that you believe is bullshit turns out to be true. I do want to add that was written and directed by Bill Paxton.
God bless Bill Paxton, man.
Talk about a treasure that we lost too soon, man.
Absolutely, and he's got a great catalog of movies. Has worked with a lot of really cool people over the years.
You can't talk about horror without talking about Bill Paxton. He has been killed by a Terminator,
an Alien,
and a Predator.
Exactly. He's got the trilogy, man. That's one of the
hat trick.
Exactly, man. That's one of the greater oddball facts in movie history. But yes, Bill Paxton, man, just his body of work he's in so many good things.
Uncompromising.
I would absolutely love to do a solid 20 to 30 minutes on Bill Paxton one day, and maybe we will. What's the first real horror type movie that won an Oscar?
Silence of the Lambs, I believe.
That's classic thriller, man.
That's classic thriller.
Clarice. We could go on and on about Silence of the Lambs. I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on that today, because that's also another good solid 10, 15 minutes at best.
Silence of the Lambs gets all the acclaim, but Red Dragon was my favorite in the series.
They were all decent. Hannibal was,
Hannibal's my least favorite of the three.
Yeah, me too. But, Ray Liotta did eat his own brain. That was fun.
I mean, if you're just talking about moments, there's moments in all three,
Of course. Gary Oldman flying on fire in the wheelchair down the hill.
Well, when the dude says he can smell her cunt,
Yeah, that's pretty nasty.
Well, but what's funny about that is when she's talking to Lecter, and he just casually says, "I, however, cannot."
Yeah. And the intentional mispronunciation of Chianti. That's Anthony Hopkins. He's a master.
I love Anthony Hopkins, and he makes some interesting choices.
He has over the years. Some good movies, though.
Talk about somebody we could do a whole episode about.
Absolutely. I think we should do an episode on Masters. Another thriller I want to talk about is a movie that I know you haven't seen, and we have talked about it a few times, but it's one I'd like to shout out because I'm a big fan of. and that's the movie Mr. Brooks. There is some questionable actors in that movie, a la Dane Cook, and I understand the not wanting to watch it for that reason alone, and trust me, I agree. But if you watch it, you'll understand the movie Memento, because you're seeing it through the eyes of a man with amnesia and just a whole bunch of clues thrown about. And, you know, the nothing is actually what it seems.
Well, you know, Guy Pearce is one of those actors that can drive a movie on his own. And in a movie like Memento, where it really is all about him being reactive to the characters around him, he carries that movie. And I think it took somebody like him to be able to tell that story, especially the way that it's all broken up and jumps around, and it's not in chronological order.
Yeah, it's meant to mess with your head because it's from that whacked out headspace.
I was going to say, it is one of those movies where you have to be in the right frame of mind to enjoy Memento.
I believe every movie that falls under this category that I'm about to talk about is going to be kind of like that. Shutter Island is an example I think of. You know, not everything is as what it seems. Another one that I haven't seen in a while, big fan of though, and this is a movie that you really only can watch in the dark when it's raining. And like you say, in the mindset, is Identity. Very interesting psychological thriller because the whole thing takes place in someone's mind.
I really liked Identity up to a point. Not to spoil it, but when you get the reveal in the movie, like when you actually find out what's going on and the mystery is over, there's still like 30 minutes of movie left. So once I find out what's actually going on in that movie, the last 30 minutes just don't have the same flavor as the first hour.
It does take a weird little turn that sort of changes the movie for sure. But the build up to that point is really, really good. Also, it makes me think of the movie The Cell.
Sure.
With Vince Vaughn, Jennifer Lopez, and Vincent D'Onofrio.
We all love Vincent D'Onofrio here.
It's our love is undying. We love Vincent D'Onofrio.
Big crush.
Totally. But that is a movie that takes place matter of fact, it takes place in his mind. You know, we touched on Stephen King, and one that comes to mind that fits in this category would be Secret Window.
John Turturro is who carries that movie, but it's done in such a good way that you fucking forget John Turturro's even there.
Oh man, Shooter.
Dude.
Shooter. That's the whole thing. Love John Turturro, by the way.
Oh man.
John Turturro, big fan. You know, a lot of things came out of the 90s. You know, you got toward the end of it, you got sort of the next generation of horror styles with like Blair Witch. I know you're a fan of Blair Witch.
So the found footage genre, I know it's controversial. You know, you have true blue horror fans that shit all over found footage, and then you have horror fans that found footage is the only reason they like horror.
To me, it's typically tough to watch because most of it's supposed to look like home video, and it's shaky and it's a little grainy. And, you know, and I understand, I get the allure of that. But for me, it kind of gives me a headache, and I think that's my problem with it.
Well, when I was a young man, and bear in mind, back then I was naive, and the way they publicized the Blair Witch to try to make it look like it was real.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Right. So going into the Blair Witch, going into the theater, I thought the Blair Witch was real.
Right. Oh, that's the way they made it look to be.
Yeah, they had me fooled. So when I'm in the theater watching this movie, I think every second of this footage that I'm seeing is just footage they found in the woods where these people got terrorized by forces unseen.
Right.
Look, I don't want to open this can of worms. The problem with the Blair Witch is everybody gets it wrong. It's Rustin Parr. and the ghosts of the 7 children he killed. If you go back watching that movie with that knowledge in mind, you will enjoy it a lot more, I promise you. That movie is brilliant. And I don't want to focus too much on the mythology because we're talking about modern day movies and the influence that found footage has had on the horror genre. You know, Blair Witch was huge, but if you jump, a decade later, Paranormal Activity took what Blair Witch did and created this huge multiverse.
I don't find it related, but I feel like another movie that managed to piggyback off of Blair Witch was The Ring. That story to me has a Blair Witchian feel, and I don't think that movie gets the American version of it made without the Blair Witch coming first.
Blair Witch, The Ring, The Grudge, anytime you get into a story where, it's a dark and stormy night, or it was a night just like this, the buildup of a story with The Ring, she watches the tape, she sees the pictures, she interacts with her family when her niece dies. That buildup to the ghost, that has a very scary, ominous feel to it. Jaws did that, but they only did that because of the budget.
When we were talking about the 90s and the sort of next generation, though, even though it was before Blair Witch and all that, what I've heard you say is the greatest horror franchise there is, and that was Scream. Scream changed horror and truly brought it mainstream.
Okay, so the original story of Scream, Wes Craven was trying to make a parody of the slasher genre. It was originally intended to be a comedy. It was originally entitled Scary Movie. But the performances from these young actors, particularly Matt Lillard and Skeet Ulrich.
Love Matt Lillard.
They were supposed to come across on screen as campy. And I do want to comment on that. Matt Lillard is a brilliant actor.
Absolutely.
Very underrated. I think he got typecast after Shaggy.
He did a lot of those goofy buddy roles over the years.
He did.
And he was great at them. But I've seen him some other things, some dramatic roles, and great actor. And,
right.
Love Matt Lillard.
They took this movie that was originally supposed to be this campy send-up to the horror genre, and their performances are unnerving.
They're incredibly good at it.
Right. The way Skeet plays the role, he does the boyfriend, the jealous, doting boyfriend very well, mm-hmm. and then it's revealed he's one of the killers.
Right.
And then he does this, he flips, and he's psycho. They even comment on that towards the end of the movie. But Matt Lillard, from the opening of the movie, from the first time you see Matt Lillard to the end, he has this childlike serial killer glee. And it's almost telling from the first time you see him. He makes nods and comments and gestures that pretty much let you know Matt Lillard is the killer from the beginning. Well, the reveal is that Skeet was helping it.
Yeah, right. The fact that there was 2, not 1. One thing both of them have, though, both Skeet and Matt, is they play a good crazy eye through that whole movie.
Absolutely.
And if you know how to spot crazy eye, it's there and gives away that they're the killers. And Scream was huge. Remakes of Scream coming up. A lot of Scream out there over the years, and interesting how they, while making a almost spoof, created a great franchise and became what it was trying to spoof in the first place.
There are many things that are great about Scream. Since you bring up the sequels in the franchise, I do want to comment, the second movie, anytime I watch a sequel, I'm weary going in. Mm-hmm. And there are very few sequels that are better than the original.
There are a few, but not many.
Argumentatively, Godfather 2 and Terminator 2 come to mind.
Disagree on The Godfather, agree on The Terminator.
So, while I wouldn't say Scream 2 is better than the original Scream, Scream 2 took an idea and created a franchise off of an idea.
That turned into gold.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, Scream 3, Scream 4, two of my favorite horror movies of all time.
Scream led to a lot of other movies trying to piggyback off of it. And like most things, that things are cyclical that way. You know, I feel like I Know What You Did Last Summer was almost like an instant homage, if you will, to the type of movie Scream was. Because again, Scream brought horror to mainstream all of a sudden.
I Know What You Did Last Summer is the Kmart of horror movies, if you want to compare Scream to I Know What You Did Last Summer.
And that's a fair statement. There's a lot of things piggybacked off of that. Another franchise that came along that I feel like it was just a little later start, but different concept entirely. But again, piggybacked off the fact that it's, you know, they were using fresh, new, big name actors and
young horror.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about.
Exactly. It was the Final Destination franchise.
Final Destination, you know, when you say horror and scary, I cannot watch that franchise because it is death, quote unquote, but it's real world things killing. Like these kids are being murdered, but they're being murdered by death.
Exactly.
And they disturb me, man.
It is
the original Final Destination made me not want to drive a car, made me not want to take a shower, made me not want to cook fucking popcorn.
Yeah, it's intense. They're intense. The whole thing was just about creating these fantastical death scenes. That's really all it was. It was like filmed Faces of Death via Cirque du Soleil. Very, like I said, fantastical.
Yeah, the highlight of that movie is Tony Todd.
There's some moments, man, and I'll tell you, and I'm not the only one who says this. I've had this conversation more than once recently about driving down the highway around a log truck.
Oh, yeah, I'm not staying behind a log truck. I've seen Final Destination.
That's Final Destination 2, but specifically. But yes, you avoid the log truck at all costs. Thanks to that movie.
Because of Final Destination, it makes me not want to leave my fucking house.
And you could die there, too.
And you could die there, too.
Funny, we got a little laugh in on this because I think about the fact that Scream and movies like Scream led to the creation of the Scary Movie franchise, which, as you say, was originally the title for Scream.
The Wayans family has been around, especially in the comedy world, for decades.
Yeah.
I think for our generation, you know, In Living Color.
That's where it started.
Absolutely. But Scary Movie, to me, is the most synonymous thing with the Wayans that I can think. Like, thinking back, Wayans, Scary Movie.
You know, I'm a big fan of Anna Faris. She's played a lot of silly roles over the years.
Frequently asked questions of time travel.
If you get real bored out there, go watch a movie called Smiley Face. It is
Don't watch Smiley Face.
It's ridiculous.
But you know, like, okay, so the Scary Movie franchise was good. The first one was really good. Part 2 was my favorite. For the Wayans.
The Wayans they're awesome.
I mean, there's something to be said about the way Anthony Anderson and Kevin Hart carried Scary Movie 3 and 4.
Right. I've always been a fan of Anthony Anderson. He's a lot of fun. He's a jolly guy.
Absolutely. You know, I've been a fan of Kevin Hart since before I knew Kevin Hart's name.
Right. Funny little guy. So, moving past that, I think about what I consider the next generation of horror after that point. You know, Scream got its day in the sun for a good solid decade, it seems. But Then in the mid 2000s, early to mid 2000s, the gore came. The gore came.
Like House of Wax and that kind of thing.
To me, it kind of started with Saw.
Oh, sure.
Now, Saw is, especially the first time you watch it, any movie with a big twist, first time you watch it, it's like, wow.
Well, you know, you say gore, but in all reality, the first Saw, it had gore, but it was a lot more psychological than it was just a gore film.
It was a combination of genres never thought to kind of go together before.
You know, it was such a brilliant movie. I don't do this often, but the first time I watched Saw, it was on DVD. I bought it on a recommendation.
Okay.
And after I watched it, I immediately started it over and watched it again. So I could watch for subtle clues or nods or anything.
I did the very same thing.
That guy on the floor. And you know what? He never fucking moves.
No, he does
and
not.
And I watched hard.
I when that first came out, I also saw it on DVD when it was first released on DVD. From a Blockbuster video, no less. And I watched it, I think, 3 or 4 times in a 2 or 3 day period because I was so enamored with it.
We were lucky when Saw came out on DVD because that was before the internet was really huge and there weren't all these spoilers.
Yeah.
And there weren't all these advertisements and you weren't seeing a trailer for the movie every 5 seconds. 28 Days Later was another one of those for me. I bought it on a recommendation. Never, didn't see many trailers for it. The way they marketed the Blair Witch back then could have never been gotten away with today with all the information we have access to.
No, that's unfortunate that movies have come to that, but the internet does have some bad points to it, and spoilers are one of them. So fans out there, don't give spoilers away. It's a shitty thing to do. But anyway, the Saw franchise, it kind of brought gore a little more to the forefront. Not so much the first one, but the second one and beyond, they had a lot of gore.
Well, that opened the door for movies like Hostel.
I've always said this about that movie. I went to the theater and saw Hostel, unfortunately. I think you and I agree that that's not really a great movie and it's not one I choose to watch.
Well, torture porn, I believe, is the common verbiage.
Well, the way I described the movie was the first half of the movie was Girls Gone Wild and the second half was Faces of Death.
If you thoroughly enjoy movies like Hostel and House of Wax, I don't want to fucking hang out with you.
I mean, it can be a little weird, I must say.
There was a time when horror movies were meant to scare you. They were meant to unnerve you. And I think it's become popular and kitschy to say you enjoy horror movies on more of a gleeful level.
Right.
Horror movies aren't really meant to be enjoyed. They're meant to scare you. It's meant to be a boogeyman. Horror movies are cautionary tales.
And in a lot of cases, I think horror movies, it just play on parts of your brain that you don't normally use, your fight or flight. So the twist in Saw, the guy on the floor, just everything about that, the way that story is told.
I don't think anybody ever expected Saw to become a franchise. So that had to force the writers and the creators of that franchise to do a little bit of one-upsmanship.
I 100% agree with that statement because it did get more and more kind of over the top throughout the films, and I did eventually stop watching newer ones. I don't know where I stopped, but...
Well, okay, so in the first one, you had the reveal that the body was actually the killer. Mm-hmm. In the second one, you had the reveal that Amanda turned out to be in cahoots with Jigsaw. And then later on, you had the reveal that the cop was the new killer.
So on and so forth.
So on and so forth. But my favorite reveal in the Saw franchise was that Part 3 and Part 4 happened at the exact same time.
Oh, yeah, that was huge.
Yeah.
That was a moment that I was just like, holy shit.
I didn't see that coming.
These guys worked so hard on weaving this perfect little puzzled tale, and it
was awesome.
It was
awesome.
But
it was a huge payoff.
But after that moment, though, anything after that, I didn't care about. That was pretty much the moment for me.
Fair enough.
Not just, didn't do it for me anymore, I guess. And it was time to move on. But twist endings, they took that shit to a whole new level.
Speaking of moving on, I'd like to focus a little bit on television horror. Well, I know growing up, man, Tales from the Crypt.
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to say, man. The Crypt Keeper.
Well, what's funny about the Crypt Keeper is here's this, little skeletal guy, Crypt Keeper, a little basket case on wheels.
Yep.
And he's supposed to be scary, but that lead in and that outro always kind of calmed me down from the intensity of the episode.
There was some wild shit on that show over the years. And the movie, it had basically 3 episodes ran together to make a movie.
So, William Sadler.
Yep.
For those of you who don't know, he was the, I guess, protagonist in the first episode of Tales from the Crypt.
Right.
Very first. Okay. He also plays a pivotal role in Demon Knight, which was the first Tales from the Crypt movie.
Shout out to Death in Bill and Ted.
Absolutely. Oh, he also plays the mummy that the Crypt Keeper is telling the story to in Bordello of Blood, the second Tales from the Crypt movie. Apparently, William Sadler was a huge fan of the genre.
I love William Sadler.
Either that or they loved him so much, they kept calling him.
He's got a face for it.
Dude, I love William Sadler, man, in anything.
Modern day TV shows of horror. And that's not something that I really watch, but I know you like the American Horror Stories franchise.
The American Horror Story franchise is really good. I don't get down on the individual American Horror Stories. But that first season and the second season, particularly Asylum, I think that's when that show really hit its stride.
Right.
It made Evan Peters a star.
Good old Ralph Boner.
Absolutely.
I can't think of him now without saying that.
No shit. I think it's unfortunate, but a little bit fortunate, that I missed the window on American Horror Story when it first premiered.
Yeah.
I had to play catch up on Netflix, but it allowed me to binge it. So I really kind of got into it. I was able to sink my teeth into it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Something I wasn't able to do that with, I watched it on Fox when it premiered, was Sleepy Hollow.
I never did catch that.
Man, it started out really strong. The first couple of episodes had Clancy Brown, which anytime he's involved in something, I get excited.
Love Clancy Brown.
Love Clancy Brown. When it started out, it was pretty much the traditional story of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, and Ichabod Crane. But then it slowly revealed that there was a deeper mythology. And all of that was really good, and you were able to dive into it. But then that was one of those shows where it suffered from the writer's strike, and it had some changeover, and ultimately it had potential, but it fizzled out.
There's another one that I think you and I both grew up with, but I got a feeling you remember it better than I do, and that's Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Submitted for the approval of the Midnight Society. Look, Are You Afraid of the Dark was definitely the thing that introduced me, and I think a lot of the people in my generation, to the horror genre.
Yeah.
It was very much a kid's show, but there were a lot of episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark that scared the shit out of me, man. There was an episode about alternate dimensions, about shadow people. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people suffer from night terrors, and it's a very real thing. And, shadow people, and just seeing them, it's very unnerving.
Yes.
There's a couple of clown episodes, and I know people who remember this show, they'll know what I'm talking about just by saying that. There were a couple of clown episodes that probably seen as the most disturbing episodes.
Around that same time, there was a show I caught. We've talked about before, and it surprises me, but it's one that you've never seen. But it was a show I absolutely loved when I was a kid. And it was the Friday the 13th, the series. Had a very unique at the time premise to it, where there was a brother and sister who had inherited an antique shop from their uncle, father, granddad, somebody or another. And turns out that all the items in this shop were haunted in some way, but gave powers to people in all these different manners. And the best example I can think of that's always stood out in my memory that was my favorite episode, there was a pocket watch that on the face of it, instead of going to 12, it went to 13. And whoever had possession of the pocket watch between the hours of 12 and 13 on this clock, time would stop for them. And they could just walk around amongst people frozen in time for an hour, as long as they had the pocket watch. And the point of the show was the brother and sister were trying to retrieve all of the items over the years that had been sold out of this shop, because there's really good logbooks conveniently for plot devices and whatnot. And each episode was dedicated to retrieving an item from the ledger. Great show. Later on, a show called Warehouse 13 came out and was more or less the same premise, but more of a government scientific warehouse to log supernatural stuff that they had to go out and find and retrieve. Oddly enough, they both had 13 in the title.
I think there's been a lot of shows in that vein, a lot of horror anthologies. The argument could be made that Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a horror anthology.
We would be remiss if we didn't at least mention The Walking Dead.
I mean, you can't talk about modern day horror without talking about The Walking Dead.
Right.
I think there actually was a lull in unique storytelling when it came to horror. There were a lot of Conjuring clones. Mm-hmm. Sinister comes to mind. But The Walking Dead was able to take a subject matter and tell it in a way that made what you would have normally seen as the horror element the background. Mm-hmm. And the things that were more horrific in that show
was what the
human element.
Absolutely.
There wasn't anything scarier in that show than people. Negan, the governor, the cannibals.
Rick Grimes.
Rick Grimes, man. Oh, man, there were moments where Rick scared me, man.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think of that kind of stuff. You mentioned a few that I'm curious, what else you got out there maybe that's some modern day horror stuff.
So I think your most popular modern day horror franchise would be The Conjuring. Now that entails The Conjuring, The Nun, and Annabelle. Mm-hmm. I would advise people to steer clear of Annabelle. Personally, I think the concept of the movie is stupid. Mm-hmm. Now, The Conjuring is good. The second one is brilliant. Now, look, the first Conjuring is a little boring. But what's good about The Conjuring 2, when that movie ends, you don't know if it's real or not. Did the events in that movie actually take place? Or was it what we were just led to believe based on the evidence that we were given?
What would be one, maybe a diamond in the rough that you would like to recommend for people looking for that really good horror movie?
Now, bear in mind, I would never say that I'm the authority on horror movies.
Of course.
But I love horror movies.
I know you do.
I grew up watching them. As far as modern day, I'll always subscribe to the Scream franchise.
Okay.
But if you're talking about diamonds in the rough, if you haven't seen The Gallows, I have to recommend this movie. For starters, it's found footage. From start to finish, that movie kind of unnerved me. But just that isolation, I've said that before.
Right. There's two things I think we failed to talk about. One I want to touch on, and I feel like it could fit into a couple of different categories of things that we've mentioned. But it is one of my favorite franchises, not just in horror, but in all movies. And that's the Evil Dead franchise. Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, Evil Dead 2 especially, and Army of Darkness.
Ash Williams is one of the most unique characters ever created in the horror genre.
Bruce Campbell is absolutely amazing in everything he does. He's just a great, great character, whatever the character is.
So, when The Evil Dead was first conceived, Sam Raimi wanted to put his buddy in the movie. So he created this character of Ash Williams, kind of a pussy in the first movie.
Yep.
He's in the whole movie, but he's very much a side character.
To the evil.
Well, to the evil, to everything going on around, and pretty much to the ensemble cast.
Yeah.
He's definitely not the main male character in that movie. Not in the first one.
No, the first one is they were trying to figure out what they were doing with the first one, and the second one to me was more or less just a reboot done correctly. Like, this is what we meant to do when we made that first one, because the first one went a little off the rails.
The first Evil Dead movie is meant to be taken seriously. But the special effects and the acting are so horrible and hokey that it comes across as a comedy. To the point where when Sam Raimi made the second movie,
he realized
he leaned into the comedy.
That's what worked for what they were doing, and they created a whole new thing, basically. And Evil Dead 2, the scene where he cuts off his hand, man, that is cinematic genius. And one of the greatest things ever done.
Bruce Campbell is an actor that is so ridiculous and over the top that you buy it.
Oh, yeah. That face of his, man. That voice. He's a great physical actor, or at least in his younger days. I doubt he's doing much of that these days. Well, then again, there was that.
The Evil Dead series, man.
Doctor Strange.
Right?
Punched himself in the street for a bit. It was great. The trilogy there, though, especially the second two, they're works of art, man. They are. Army of Darkness, the Necronomicon, man.
Bruce Campbell was able to take a character like Ash Williams and make him so iconic that the name of the third movie is Bruce Campbell versus the Army of Darkness.
Exactly, man.
Oh, Army of Darkness is my favorite movie in the franchise. Hands down, no question about it.
I love Army of Darkness, but 2 is my favorite in the franchise. I love them both a whole lot, but I got to give a slight nod to 2.
2 might have been a more entertaining movie, but when you talk about the character of Ash Williams, I guarantee you everybody thinks of the way he plays that character in Army of Darkness. And I'm here to tell you that even though there was a lot of camp in that second movie, Ash Williams in Army of Darkness is a completely different character than where we started.
Oh, 100% on that. It's just a phenomenal franchise, man.
Army of Darkness is what happens when a writer, director, and actor just say fuck it, and it becomes brilliant.
Exactly. Now that we've covered the greatness that is those, there's another thing that I feel like we have forgotten about, and that's the concept and horror of using aliens and space as your settings and your plot points.
Well, now that depends on where you're going with it, because I think you can separate those elements greatly.
Oh, of course you can.
Space on its own can be horrifying.
Yep.
Without the element of aliens.
But I think for horror, you get more aliens than you do just space.
Oh, I agree with you there. Alien.
Well, Aliens, of course, is to me the definitive space horror.
Oh, man, there's nothing scarier than Paul Reiser.
In space, no one can hear you scream.
Even Paul Reiser.
Not even Paul Reiser. Great franchise, each movie different from the last. The first 2 are probably the only 2 I would ever go back and watch, though.
I loved 3. 3 gets a lot of shit, man, but I really enjoyed 3. Being on the prison planet, and they all had the shaved heads, and
I mean, they all had their things, don't get me wrong.
But, man, and I know it's a small element, but I like Charles Dutton.
Rock.
Absolutely.
I've always liked Charles Dutton myself.
Well, not to jump into it, but we are talking horror. Him being the killer in Gothica was awesome.
Right?
What a shock at the end of that movie.
That was a solid movie. Interesting cast there. Robert Downey Jr., Halle Berry. That's very, very solid cast going on there. And Charles Dutton getting to hang with them.
But speaking of not being able to hear you scream, hack.
Mars Attacks, man.
Mars Attacks was able to get away with a lot of shit that a lot of movies aren't.
Right. That was a movie, it's like you watch it and it's so bad you want to hate it, but it's impossible to.
But what's fun, even though that's a hokey, stupid movie, the things that the aliens do to the humans are so horrific, man.
Oh, yeah.
I couldn't imagine waking up and having my head sewn to a fucking dog.
Yeah, man. That's very, very...
And we get...
That's a whacked out movie.
Hey, we get to see Jack Black melt in that one.
Yeah, we do. Another one I can think of, just an interesting sort of alien movie, is The Puppet Masters.
Man, look, when you have aliens taking over human life, you call Donald Sutherland.
Right. He's been in a lot of stuff.
Man, I love Donald Sutherland.
Yeah, me too, man.
But Puppet Masters, look, I know it plays a lot off of Tales from the Body Snatchers. Mm-hmm. But they were able to, in the mid-90s, they doubled down on that special effects element.
Right.
Hey, the special effects were good. There was a lot of intrigue. Now, bear in mind, you knew what was going on the whole time. You went in knowing that the aliens were taking over the humans. So there were no surprises. I think the performances and the special effects is what drove that movie.
Yeah, a lot of fun, though. Anything with Donald Sutherland, though, typically, a lot of fun. One that I think of, and it's a lot different than a lot of the other ones. It was very unique, was District 9. That's done in such a different way because it's not like the aliens are invading or anything. They're refugees.
For me, District 9 is a lot like The Walking Dead. And I know that sounds strange, but let me explain. The aliens are the background.
Yeah.
The scary part of that movie is the isolation that he feels being in that that ghetto, as it were.
Yep.
Here's this guy, he's middle management trying to get a promotion. So he makes this risky maneuver and he goes in depth into this ghetto where there's not only, human, but alien dregs of society.
Right.
And being, lost in that world, not being able to communicate, not being able to get the help that he needs is more horrific than any of the science fiction things going on.
Again, back to the humanity of it all. There was The Faculty. That was one, I believe I saw that in the theater in the late.
What an underrated movie.
Launched the career of Josh Hartnett.
Yeah, I think all that Tommy Hilfiger tie-in, it dated and murdered that movie.
Yeah. But at the time, solid flick.
Oh, man, The Faculty was really solid. Look, when he rips off the blade from the paper cutter and uses it to lop the alien's fucking head off.
Yeah.
Dude.
I'll tell you one that if you were to watch this in the wrong mindset, could totally twist your mind. That's Fire in the Sky.
Man, Fire in the Sky still scares me to this day.
It is very deep, man.
It's hard to watch, man.
It is. There's one particular scene in that involving a large needle and an eyeball, and I do not like it. But great movie, though. Very good movie.
Fire in the Sky disturbed me. I think it came out around the time I was like 11 or 12, and I think anytime something like that scares you at that age, you carry it with you into adulthood.
Yeah.
And I still have problems thinking about that movie.
Well, what about Deep Space? Now that's scary.
Well, when you're talking deep space, you got to be talking about Event Horizon.
Right.
Now, there's no aliens
Exactly. It's just space itself.
It's space itself, but I think...
And the humanity aspect, which always comes into play.
There's the humanity. There is a big debate on what is actually going on in Event Horizon.
It has been a debate for years.
Now, the long and short of it, in my personal opinion, when the ship travels through time and space, it enters some kind of hell dimension. And when it came out the other side, the Event Horizon brought something back with it.
Some kind of evil tag-along to make for space horror.
Whether that's some kind of subspace alien creature or
an entity
from hell. We don't really know. But evil is on that ship. I love Event Horizon. But more or less, Event Horizon is nothing more than a ghost ship in space.
Sure.
And if you're going to talk about ghost ships, well, then you have to talk about Ghost Ship.
It's literally the name of the movie.
Not to give too much away, but basically a salvage team goes to a ship to salvage its cargo. But little do they know that a Reaper is there to salvage souls. Now, what makes that movie so great, and I think this could be said about a lot of movies, is front and center, Gabriel Byrne.
Love Gabriel Byrne. He has been in some really great movies over the years.
A lot of great movies that scared me.
He has an ominous presence about him in a lot of his roles.
He does.
And he also carries a very underhanded, sneaky kind of...
He has an unnerving presence.
He does. I mean, some not necessarily horror movies, but it might have some thriller elements. There's like Usual Suspects, you know.
Cool World.
Cool World, depending on your point of view, can be pretty dark and evil and almost a horror movie in certain aspects of it.
I was going to say, you know, there's some sexiness to Cool World, but underlying, there's some horror there.
Absolutely. Early Brad Pitt movie, by the way.
Very early.
Hollywood.
Hollywood if she could.
If I'm not mistaken, was Gabriel Byrne not in Excalibur?
Oh, he was. He played Uther Pendragon.
Nice. That's a great name.
Patrick Stewart in that one as well.
I have an interesting story for you. And I think maybe we can wrap our episode up on this.
Okay.
It's an ironic thing that happened to me years ago. Since we're talking about Gabriel Byrne. My ex-wife, when I first got with her, it was the early days of DVDs. And she had kicked out her ex-boyfriend prior to me dating her or living with her. And when he moved out, he took all the DVDs they had except for 2. There was one in a case and one that he had taken the case but didn't realize was in the DVD player. And those 2 movies were Stigmata and End of Days. Both horror-esque movies starring Gabriel Byrne.
Well, I mean, you got one movie where Gabriel Byrne is the devil, and then one movie where Gabriel Byrne is fighting the devil.
I know, right? And they came out within probably a year of each other at the same time. Like, you know, but yet not typecasting. Gabriel Byrne is a fascinating actor. Big fan. Keep up the good work, buddy.
Is it ironic that Gabriel Byrne pisses fire in End of Days and burns down a house?
It's fantastic. Well, everybody, I think we have talked about all we can talk about this Halloween on this subject. All you ghouls and goblins out there, keep up the good work.
Check under the bed. You never know what's lurking in the shadows.